Okay, Be'ezrat Hashem, let's see what we can manage. Otherwise, you do it, David.
Okay.
I'll tell them my brother-in-law is going to be Mamale Mokum.
Listen carefully. You need to do it next week, but keep it going. How you going? Now.
Okay, are we ready?
Yes, we're all ready. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the Shiur tonight. May our learning be in the zechut of our beloved husband and dad, Le'ilu Nishmat, Harav Abraham Chaim ben Eliezer Yaakov, Zecher Tzadik Libracha, and our dear and precious Goldie Miriam but Abraham Chaim, Zichrona Libracha. May they both intercede on high on behalf of all of us. May our learning also go towards Israel. May Hashem protect our people and our land. Am Yisrael Chai. Over to you, Dov.
Good evening and welcome. And tonight's a very special night indeed because it's we're leading up to Shavuot, and tonight and tomorrow actually has a special title. It's called the Yom HaMeyuchas. It's the Meyuchas Day. It's the day that has a yichus. Since today was Rosh Chodesh Sivan, the day they came to Mount Sinai, and Friday, the 3rd of Sivan, is going to be the Shloshes Yemei Kabbalah, and that's already the 3 days of preparation for Shavuot. Today, the 2nd of Sivan, really is in between. It doesn't have a special quality of its own. That's why it's called Yom HaMeyuchas. Its specialness is derived from the company that it keeps, that it's between, sandwiched between such great chashuv days, and it's a very important opportunity to learn Torah, specifically in these days leading up to Shavuot, because in Shemaim, especially in the Shloshes Yemei Hakbala, as we get closer to Shavuot, the question is asked: do the Jewish people still value the Torah? And it's a wonderful zechus, an achievement that we can still, at the tip of Africa, be studying the Torah of the Mishnah through the Rishonim, through the lens of the Achronim, and through the lessons of my dear, our dear great father. And that's obvious. And especially this week, it should be, as my sister said, it should be a zechus for Eretz Yisrael. Our heart goes out to all those who have lost loved ones and all those who have been wounded. Yerachem Hashem, Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael. Hashem should protect all the Jewish people wherever they are. And we're still very much in the wake of Miron 5781, which left a terrific searing scar in Klal Yisrael, and to them too, may our learning together be a zechus and a benefit. So let's go on to our next Mishnah. Rabban Gamliel Haya Omer. We're starting off now, Mishnah 16 in Pirkei Avos. Rabban Gamliel, he used to say, now he is the first of the sages of the last number of Mishnayos that post the Zugas. Until now it was Hillel and Shammai, Yosef ben Yochanan, Yosef ben Yoezer. Everyone had a Zug. Klal Yisrael was led by a partnership. There were two. Remember, the Nasi and the Av Beis Din. And this is now the first of the rest of the Mishnayos, where it's led by a single person again. Rabban Gamliel Haya Omer. And it's also interesting to note, it doesn't say who he received the tradition from, or even that he received the tradition. It simply tells us what he used to say. So two outstanding features of Rabban Gamliel. In terms of the flow of the Mishnah, he didn't have a partner, he wasn't a zug, he was an individual leader, and doesn't say kiblu. The Tosfos Yom Tov wants to suggest, you know why it doesn't say kibel, he didn't receive the tradition? Because Klal Yisrael, at this point, there was another step down. It's called Yeridas Hadoros. Every generation inexorably is lower than the previous generation in stature, in greatness. Even though it's true, in localized areas, we have areas where we are more particular than the last numbers of generations. But in the actual stature of the people, the greatness of their ruchnis, their neshama, their Torah, their clarity of Yiddishkeit, of Yiras Shamayim, every generation is lower. So this was another very great drop. It wasn't a flow. There's each in Jewish history, every generation is one step lower, but then sometimes there's a massive drop. For example, my Rosh Hashiva of Gusman, who survived the Holocaust, he was a Dayan in Vilna, to Chaim Ozer Gudzinski before the Holocaust, and he became a Rosh Hashiva in Brooklyn after the Holocaust, and then in Eretz Yisrael. He went to Eretz Yisrael, and that's where I was zecher to learn. I mean, he was truly one of the great giants. And he said about the Holocaust, for the rest of his life, he said that, in exactly this point, in Jewish history, every generation is a bit lower. But he said, before the Holocaust and after the Holocaust, we lost so much that it wasn't just a step down. It was a plunge. We fell into an abyss. And since then, the Gedolei Israel have been leading a cry to build, to rebuild, to recapture something of the spirit. And in many ways, we've done, with Hashem's help, phenomenally, miraculously well. But there's still the Yeridus Hadoros. And this is Rabban Gamliel. He's Rabban Gamliel, but he's the first one in Pirkei Avos, interestingly enough, to be given his title, Rabban Gamliel. He's not just Hillel was Hillel, Shammai was Shammai. Rabban Gamliel is introduced with his own title, and in some ways that's also a sign, some say, of the lowering of the generation. So coming back to the Tosfos Yom Tov, it doesn't say he received the tradition, because that implies that he received it in its totality, in its shleimus, in its wholeness. And the problem is that nobody anymore was great enough to contain it all b'shleimus, the entire Kabbalah. He could only take out his piece. This is the opinion that the Tosfos Yom Tov offers, which is a very sad comment, implying that a whole lot got lost. Tosfos Yom Tov himself doesn't like the parish entirely, even though it's important enough that he brings it. He himself says, even though no one was great enough, and there was certainly a descent of the generations, the Yeridas Hadoros, he says, yet miraculously the Torah is whole. We've seen Yidden from the east and from the west. They're different minhagim, but in minutiae, not in fundamentals. Fundamentals, there is a Kabbalah, there is a Messiah. Throughout Golus, with a very little and very difficult communication from one end of the world to the other. To send a letter took weeks, took months. You never knew if you got there. It would take you years to get a response. And yet, the tradition is there. So he doesn't like it, but we make the observation anyway. Rabban Gamliel, he was outstanding in another interesting hanhoga, which sadly carried out to this day. He introduced, in order not to shame the poor, that everybody gets buried in a simple shroud, a pashut shroud. Until his days, wealthier people put on a fancier show. Could become almost not mummified, but dressed up like a lahavdil, like some debutant. He insisted, and not only insisted, the Gemara Moed Katan said, he himself, when he passed away, he insisted that he be interred in a simple shroud, and that was the end of that debate. And since then, for all Jewish history, doesn't matter how much a person has, a simple shroud is all he takes from this world. So this is the Heilige Rabban Gamliel. And Rabban Gamliel, let's see what his take on the motto, his ethos for the character of Jewish people is. He says as follows, 3 things. Aseh lecho rav. Make for yourself a teacher. Appoint for yourself a teacher. Histalek min hasofek. Remove yourself from uncertainty. V'altar be'la'aser u'modus. And do not give excessive tithes from your field, u'madus, with a measuring, with estimating. Rather, it should be with a measure. U'madus, according to this, Perush means estimate. Don't give your tithes by an estimate. Don't even err on the side of caution and give more. We'll discuss it. So these are the 3 halachas that he says. And it's very interesting to find out what was the point. What was the nakuda that he's making? What's his central theme? So let's start again. Aseh lecho rav. Make for yourself a rav, a Rebbe. Some people think that it's only Hasidim who have a Rebbe and who go to great distances to be close to the Rebbe. It's not true. It's not true. The Olam Yeshivas, maybe we don't always spend Yamim Tovim by the Rebbe, but even that would be cherished. We have a Rebbe in very many ways not dissimilar. Asay lecha Rav means all of us. You need to have a Rebbe, and your Rebbe's got to be a great Rebbe. Now, the interesting ha'orah that they make, and let's just introduce the theme of the Mishnah. His theme of these three things: Histalek min hasafek. Don't allow yourself to live in confusion. See, without a Rebbe, what can happen is that a person gets himself into a stalemate because he thinks, what I should do is on this hand. And then he comes up with on the other hand, I think that. And for himself, he's a good sparring partner. So what you have is a fellow, he may be a learned fellow, but right now he doesn't know what to do. Because as Dad used to say, the famous joke, one of his regular old jokes, was that he needed a one-handed lawyer, because the problem with the two-handed lawyers is, on the one hand, you could do this, and on the other hand, you could do that. It leaves you in a state of confusion. So Rabban Gamliel said, Asay lecho Rav. You must have a Rav. And remember, it's interesting that coming in the period of history that he was coming in, he felt, even though your Rav is not of the stature of the Zugos, and Klal Yisrael has clearly seen something of a decline, nevertheless, Asay lecho Rav. You need a Rav. Person must have a Rav, not just for theoretical matters, to teach him how to learn a sugya, the artistry, the mastery of a sugya, to teach him how to act. They asked Rav Moshe Feinstein, they said, Rav Moshe, we know you're the Gadol Hador, but tell me, we have a Shulchan Aruch, we have a Chayei Adam, we have a Shulchan Aruch Harav, we have a Mishnah Brura, we have an Aruch HaShulchan, we have a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. They're all codifying the laws for us. Why do we need you? So Moshe, with his humility, but with his strength, knowing his job and knowing who he was, said, now that you have all those Sorim, that's why you need me. It's exactly why you need a Rebbe, because you need to know how to navigate. A Rebbe is not just to teach you tight what the words mean. There's another layer. Within yourself, you always will get, or you will often get to a stalemate, because you're two-sided. And you should be able to match and outwit your own arguments. You're going to live in the state of confusion. And this is the thrust of Rabban Gamliel's message. The essence of Torah, multiplicity of opinions, multiple views, different ways of looking at every subject. That's wonderful, but avoid confusion. Don't end up living your life in a state of confusion. This one says that, this one says that. I don't know what to do. For that, what do you need? A Rebbe. You need a Rav. Asay lecho Rav. You need a Rav. You need someone who can somehow release you from these sfeikus. I remember one great Talmid Chacham was in South Africa and he worked very closely with my dad. I'll tell you, Rabbi Aaron Pfeiffer, he said to me once, he said, your father has an unbelievable midah of humility. He said, where does he see this, Anova? He says, kids come to him at school after davening and they ask him even the most basic questions. Dad always says, who Rabbi Pfeiffer is? Let's ask him. He says, obviously your father can answer all those questions, but he doesn't want to. He says, Rabbi Aaron is here. So maybe he was being deferential. And probably he was. He wanted to give kavod as he was a master of giving kavod. But there is something else in there. Dad really believed in it. Consult again. Why? Because the human nature is biased. Our bias is built into our human nature. There are people who say, and we've all heard them say it, and we said it ourselves sometimes, say, I've thought about this long time and I'm convinced that this is the thing to do. And they're still wrong often. But they should have. I thought about it a long time on absolute, but you thought about it all the time with the same bias. So you kept on coming back to the same point. It doesn't help that you thought about it for a long time. You just confused yourself more and more. And that's not a bad thing. It's an indication that you're up against yourself. And when you're up against yourself, it's a stalemate. You're going to get used to living in confusion. And that's what Rabban Gamliel wants to avoid. And therefore he says, Asay lecho Rav, you need a Rav, you need a Rebbe, you need someone who's greater than you. You need someone, truth is, even if he's not greater than you, at least he's more objective on your issues than you. And therefore you should still defer to him. At one point I used to tell Dad that he was ma'urim v'tumim. I said, you're smart, Dad, you understand things. I see that you have a natural chokhmah. Sometimes I have to beg you to get it out of you, because he never liked to tell people what to do. He didn't want to rule for you. But I said, you have an uncanny gut feel of the way things should go. So I said, do me a favor, just tell me what you think. Don't take responsibility for it. Don't explain the reasoning to me for it. Just tell me what you think. It's called the Urim V'Tumim. You might say it's a cop-out, but the truth is, after you've thought about the subject, and you should think about it as much as you can, and you should realize that you can easily come to stalemate, always seek advice. Consult. You can still do whatever you want, but consult. Often I used to ask Dad, and he used to say to me, that I think is one for your yoyasim. Why don't you give your Rebbe a call? He insisted, and he always encouraged that I have a very close connection to my great Rebbeim in Eretz Yisrael, and with Reb Aaron himself in South Africa. In those days, he always encouraged it. He didn't see it as any competition at all, and it was in fact a fundamental of his approach to chinuch. Give your children a Rebbe. Encourage them to have contact and confidence in the Rebbe. So there's a wonderful story told about the Noda B'Yehuda, one of the greatest geniuses of the Achronim of Prague. And he asked a Chassid, Rav Shmelke of Nikolsburg, who was a Chassid of the Maggid of Mezrich. But this Rav Shmelke was, besides being a Chassid, he was renowned across the world for his legendary studiousness. In fact, him and his brother used to learn together all day, but they had an arrangement. You stop when you drop. That's all. You carry on learning until you drop. What does it mean until you drop? You're too tired even to arrange your head on your hand. You just drop. That's when you justify to stop your learning. Really, that's how they lived. Simple lives, but absolute to the end of your energy for learning for Torah. And yet, he used to, as is the want of the Hasidim, he used to trek to go Aliyah L'Regel to see his Rebbe. So the Noda B'Yehuda, who wasn't a Hasid, he was a Lithuanian, I'm not sure of what, I think he was a Poshet, I think he wasn't a Hasid at all. He said to him, how can you take your time from your learning? I know how committed you are to your learning. I know how much it means to you. I know how much you evaluate each moment. Legendary. But yet you take over weeks and possibly even months to go and spend time with your Rebbe. Why? What can he teach you? As I said, Rav Shmelke himself was an awesome guy. And what was Rav Shmelke's answer? He said, he quoted our Mishnah, Say lecho Rav. As clever as you are, you're going to come to have doubts because you're up against yourself. You're going to have doubts even about your emunah because you're up against yourself. And therefore, he said, that's what I need the Rebbe for. The Rebbe will restore my confidence in me. That's, I say, lecho Rav, make a Rav who builds you, who not only teach, this is his chiddush, a Rav doesn't just teach you the facts. He doesn't just teach you the texts. He teaches you who you are. He gives you a new vision, a new faith in yourself, in your potential, in your emunah. He said, that's why I go to see my Rebbe. And if a person doesn't have a Rebbe, and especially a Rebbe who he has confidence in, he will rely on him. Because if you don't, I say lecha Rav, he has to be greater than you. You have to feel that he's greater than you. As I said, if you don't find someone, simply get someone who's more objective than you. But ideally, Find the Rebbe who's got the experience, who's got the wisdom, who's got the age, who's got seniority. You can rely on him. That's asay lecha rav. Otherwise, you end up living with uncertainty and you become used to fuzziness and confusion. And Rabbi Gamliel said that's the opposite of Torah. But before we get to the next clause, let's say asay lecha rav. It doesn't say bechar lecha, choose for yourself a rav. It says asay. You have to make for yourself a rav. How do you make for yourself a rav? Because the truth is that a Rav is not just the greatest in the generation. Ideally, you want a Rav who understands you and your koiches and your tafkid in the world. He understands your background. He understands your family. So when you ask him a question, he's not just relying on Ruach HaKodesh. He has a nuanced understanding of where you fit in, of what is your special task. That's asay lecha Rav. For that, you have to make him into Rav. You have to actually not just appoint him, you have to make him. You have to build him into Rav. There has to be a relationship with him so that you don't get a one-size-fits-all answer. You're not just relying on Ruach HaKodesh. I know I spoke to my Rebbe just today. I had the zechus to talk to him. Anytime I come up against myself, my wife reminds me when I forget, you're going to get frustrated, you're going to get confused. Don't just ask. You've got it wrong. Ask your Rav. And the Rav tells me many times, he says, I have special siyata d'shmaya. I don't have Ruach HaKodesh. I have siyata d'shmaya because you turn to me, you rely on me. And this is a very precious relationship that our Mishnah is engraving. This is part of the Torah personality, part of the Torah culture. Asay lecha Rav. You're still smart. You don't have to worry. You can still choose. You can choose to overrule. Asay lecha Rav. Consult, 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 and make that a very important part of your team. You shouldn't be just flying solo all the time. You need an important part is a Rebbe that you can consult with, and this was very much something that Dad taught us. Because as human beings, we are always biased. And the more we think often, the more biased we become, the more we become involved in our bias. And there's a Hasidic pshat, not even Hasidic pshat, there's a known pshat that Amalek has the same gematria as Sofek. Histalek mina Sofek. That's the second clause in our Mishnah. Avoid Sofek. Don't allow yourself to live in a state of doubt and confusion. If you have this relationship with the Rav, you've thought the matter through to its conclusion, go and consult with someone who's greater than you, who has your best interests in heart. It will give you something called menuchas hanefesh and clarity. Above all, Torah is meant to provide for us clarity, not confusion. Person would think, there's so many different opinions. This is called confusion. Something called a relationship to a Rav who will help you to negotiate and to navigate all the vicissitudes and all the opinion. And that's a crucial part of learning Torah. That was Rabbi Gamliel's input in our Mishnah. Histalek min ha-sofek, avoid sofek. And let's go on to the last one. The last one says that the last clause, al tarbe le'aser umadus, do not give more tithes than is necessary. Remember, tithe is 1/10 of your produce, meant to give to the Levi, or to the poor in different years of the Shemitah, exactly 1/10. Don't say, no, I'll give a little bit more. I'm not going to take the trouble to measure it. I'll go on the safe side. Don't do that. You have to give the exact amount. The Yerushalmi says, if you give him more, let's say, you want to give, so it'll be 12%, at least I'll be safe. What could be wrong with that? So the truth is that you have to make the food, Jewish food, can be treif if the animal is got a problem or it's a non-kosher animal, or it could be treif because you just haven't given the needy their part. It's still treif. And in fact, in halacha, it's more treif than the other food. Incredible. But the way you kosher it is you give away 10%. Now the Levi, he can eat his 10% because his 10% is called tithes. And now the Yisrael can eat the rest. But if you give him more, it doesn't become called tithes. It's not called a tithe because it's more. And it's also not part of the original one that is now called kosher because it had its tithe separated because you gave it together with the tithe. It's a problem. Nobody can eat it. It's not a tithe and it's not a non-tithe. Can't give more because that's if you give more, you're going to end up also giving less. This is an incredible wisdom. Don't say, no, I don't need a rib. I don't need to ask so many shilas because, you know what, I'll always err on the side of caution. Now, what happens, human nature to people who err on the side of caution, eventually they say, you know what, I've erred so much on the side of caution, this time I'll undercut it. I'll still be safe over. Oh, that's the problem. So there's a divine wisdom over here. The divine wisdom says, don't go too far to the right. Don't go too far to the left. Because you're going to mess up. Even if you go too far to the right, you could still mess up. For example, let's take an example, and we're going to conclude over here. Lashon Hara. Person says, you know, I'm not going to learn all the halachot. I'm not going to make a rav for myself. I'm not going to ask shilas in Lashon Hara. I'll just be careful. What's going to be? And when I have a suffix, I'm going to err on the side of caution. So let's say this story happened many, many times. Somebody hired a carpenter. They came, they fitted out the kitchen. Or they hired them in order to do that. The person came in, spent a day or two taking everything apart, disassembled the entire thing, got paid more than a comfortable deposit, and then on the third day, never came back, never saw them again. So this person, the client, went over to a friend who had actually recommended this original carpenter and said, listen, I don't have any grudge against you, but that guy came in to do the work. He took apart the whole thing. He made a terrific mess. I paid him handsomely. He's disappeared. And what do you think the first client said? The friend said, I can't believe he also did that to you. So the friend said, what do you mean he also did that to me? He did that to you. So how did you recommend you? He said, no. When you asked me about him, I didn't want to speak Lashon Hara. That's a problem. That's what happens, erring on the side of caution. Person, don't err on the side of caution because you could be making a greater problem. Could be worse. You have to know what you're talking about. And where you're unsure, don't live with fuzziness. Because Hashem doesn't want a fuzzy avoider. Torah means clarity. It means light. That's what Shavuot is all about. Hashem introduced a clarity into a world that can otherwise be very confusing and very dark. The ikar of this is to have this clarity and this clear lines. Dad used to love to quote the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish who said as follows, I have trained myself. He read this to us in a letter from the Chazon Ish. I have trained myself that we don't lift a finger without looking in the Shulchan Aruch first. That's the Shulchan Aruch. The job of Shulchan Aruch should not be sfekas. And when you have a suffix, Rabbi Gamliel says, don't live with that confusion. It's damaging. It hurts your mind. It'll hurt your Yiddishkeit. It'll confuse you completely. Don't live with that. You need a Rebbe. And Zadie, Dad used to finish off, he used to say, says often he's seen it. People who work so hard, they spend all weekend at the office working, but then they won't even be there on the times where they should be there because they felt they gave away so much already. So this is what Rabbi Gamliel says, don't get used to doing overboard things. Do what you need to do and hold yourself Zat Hashem to that standard. Thank you for learning with us and wishing you a Chag Sameach and a happy Kabbalah Torah and a good gebenchte year, a year of great blessing through the Kabbalah Torah. Thank you.
Thank you for that incredible wisdom and Chag Sameach to everyone. Have a good night.